This is something that happened to me, and I still have no concrete explanation for it. I lived in Japan for 2 years, way out on the island of Kyushu, in a really rural town. I was teaching English there, and I lived in an apartment complex with 9 other English teachers and a handful of Japanese families. All of our apartments were 2-story, townhouse style. My apartment was the newest out of the bunch. Before me there had been another English teacher who lived there for 2 years, but before her, as far as I had been told, the apartment had been empty. I first moved in at the beginning of August, which is brutally hot and humid in Japan. It's so humid that the wallpaper in your apartment gets wet and starts to curl up. The only air conditioning in the apartment was downstairs, and the bedrooms were upstairs. It was truly unpleasant, and I ended up having to sleep downstairs to avoid the sweltering heat in my bedroom. That is how everything started. One day I came home from school to find my back door wide open. It was a sliding glass door, and before I left for school, I had securely bolted it. I had locked the front door as well. At first I thought maybe someone had broken in, but nothing had been taken, and not a single thing was out of place. One of my neighbors came over and looked everywhere with me, but we found nothing strange. At the time, I thought it was no big deal. Probably just some curious Japanese kid who thought it would be fun to break in and look at what a foreigner's house was like. That night I was downstairs, and I just lay down on my futon to go to sleep. All of a sudden I heard footsteps upstairs. At first it sounded like someone pacing back and forth between the 2 bedrooms. Then, suddenly, they stopped. At this point I was laying on my futon, shaking and holding my breath. I was terrified that whoever broke in earlier had managed to hide upstairs in the crawl space. After about a minute of silence, I heard an incredibly loud bang, as though something huge and heavy had just fallen and hit the floor above me. I ran right out of my apartment and went to my neighbor's house. I convinced my neighbor to come back with me, and we searched upstairs, but we found nothing. This continued to happen every night, like clockwork. One night I was at the local bar with one of the other English teachers. He had been living there for 5 years. I started telling him about the strange things that kept happening every night and how I hadn't been able to sleep because of it. "Well, there's a reason for that," he said. "Before you, there was another teacher in that apartment, but before her, the apartment was empty. Nobody would live there because a woman hung herself upstairs after her husband left her. Japanese people wouldn't rent it because they thought the place was cursed. So it was empty until the Board of Education decided to rent it out to foreign teachers. At the time, I thought he was just making up things to try and scare me, but one day I asked my boss about it. He immediately turned white and said that the other teachers shouldn't be telling me things like that. I tried to press him for more information, but he would neither confirm or deny it. One day, while cleaning my apartment, I noticed something on the underside of the windowsill. Someone had carved the words, "Try to smile," in Japanese about 10 times. When I saw that, I think my blood literally ran cold. I still don't know what actually happened in that apartment, but every night during the summer, until I would start sleeping upstairs again, those noises would happen without fail. There was a 3-year-old boy who lived in a village in the Golan Heights in Israel, near the border with Syria. The boy was born with a red birthmark on his forehead. As soon as he was old enough to talk, he told his family that he had lived before. He pointed to the birthmark and said that he'd been murdered with an axe. The boy's parents took him to the village where he claimed he had lived. There they met with the village elders. The boy said he remembered his old name. It was the name of a man who had gone missing from the village 4 years before. He also showed them the house where he had lived. The boy said he remembered the name of the man who killed him. When the boy saw the man, he walked right up to him and said, "I used to be your neighbor. We had a fight, and you killed me with an axe." The man's face turned white as a sheet. Then the boy told the village elders, "I even know where he buried my body." They followed the boy to a nearby field, and he stopped in front of a pile of stones. When they removed the stones, they found a skeleton underneath. There was a wound in the skull, in exactly the same place where the boy's red birthmark was. The boy showed them where the axe was buried as well. At that point, the man broke down and confessed to the murder. There is a small village on the island of Hawaii called Ula'a. Nobody would ever guess the terrible secret this village holds. Following the accidental drowning of a young boy many years ago, today the tragedy still haunts the villagers and their children. Back in 1947, a group of kids were playing on the banks of a deep pond. They were outside the village. One boy accidentally tripped over a log and fell into the water with a splash. Before any of the other children could react, the boy sank beneath the water's shimmering surface. For a few moments they waited for him to resurface, but there was no sign of him. Horrified, they ran back to the village to get help. Some local men came as fast as they could and dived into the pond, searching all around for the young boy. They were terrified by what they found. The boy was sitting on a rock at the very bottom of the pond. His arms were hanging down by his sides and his body was swaying back and forth with the currents. His eyes were wide and his mouth was hanging open, but he was dead in the water. The eerie sight sent shivers down the spines of the men who had dived in to save him. They were deeply disturbed and said it was such an unusual way to drown. It was as if the boy had calmly sat down on the rock and waited there to die. They retrieved the corpse and dragged it onto the bank of the pond. Everyone who lived in the village was saddened by the tragedy, but after the funeral, they all tried to put the strange death behind them. Afterwards, bizarre rumors began to spread around the area. In the middle of the night, villagers would hear unexplained screams and cries coming from the direction of the pond. At first, they tried to tell themselves that the haunting cries were just caused by the wind blowing through the tall trees. However, as time went on, some people started to report disturbing experiences. Whenever people walked past the pond at night, they would feel something reaching out and trying to grab their feet. Many villagers believed that the ghost of the drowned boy lurked beneath the dark waters of the pond. They said that, at night, he would come to the surface, cold, wet, and shivering, his icy hands clutching at an unsuspecting victim and trying to pull them into his watery grave. According to the rumors, he was trapped in the world by accident, and the only way he could escape was to find someone else to take his place at the bottom of the pond. One day, a boy was out walking with his father. When they passed by the haunted pond, the boy picked up some stones and skimmed them across the surface of the water. Suddenly, the boy screamed out in terror. Something was holding his leg and dragging him into the pond. The boy clawed at the earth, trying to hold on, but it was no use. Before his father had a chance to grab hold of him, the boy was pulled down into the watery depths. The desperate father jumped into the pond and tried to find his son, but there was no trace of him. Minutes later, he dived deeper and finally located the young boy. He was sitting on a rock, on the bottom of the pond, arms placidly at his side, eyes and mouth wide open, swaying gently to and fro in the current. The father grasped his son, pulled him up to the surface. He made his way to the edge of the pond, dragging his son behind him like dead weight. Luckily, the father had taken some courses in first aid, and there, on the bank, he was able to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on his son. The man did everything he could, and finally, just when he was about to give up, he saw his son's chest rise and fall, and the boy coughed up all the water in his lungs. The boy was alive. After that, all the parents in the village warned their children to stay away from the pond. A priest was brought in to bless the waters, and the local people felt that it would put an end to the haunting. However, on particularly dark nights, when the evening skies were black as ink, those who lived closest to the pond claimed that they could still hear the boy's terrifying screams. Some say that he will never find peace. Nowadays, nobody dares venture close to the pond, and every child in the village knows the story of the drowned boy. No one knows when the ghost will once again grow restless and try to claim another young life. Years ago, my uncle owned a funeral home and I got a summer job, working part-time in the crematorium. It wasn't a lot of fun, but it certainly paid well, and being a poor student, I definitely needed the money. Dealing with dead bodies was very creepy at first, but after a few days, you kind of get used to it. Kind of. One morning I was sweeping the floor in the crematorium when a black hearse pulled up in the parking lot outside. A man in a black suit stepped out, and my uncle went over to talk to him. After a while, he called me over and told me to help him carry the coffin into the crematorium. I thought this was strange, because usually they brought the coffins into the funeral home next door first. But I didn't ask any questions. We set the coffin down on the ground, and my uncle went over to prepare the oven for cremation. For a few minutes I was left alone with the man in the black suit. There was an awkward silence. I didn't know what to say. I assumed it was his relative who had just died and was laying in the coffin, but he didn't seem all that upset. When the oven was ready, my uncle and I picked up the coffin and brought it over to a metal bench. We took off the top of the casket. I saw that the corpse inside was a man who looked to be about 30 years old. Usually the dead bodies were very pale, but this one looked pink in the face. My uncle stoked the fire, then pressed a button to start the conveyor belt. The coffin was moved slowly into the oven. When it was all the way inside, my uncle closed the door and I just stood around waiting. It usually took an hour before everything was burnt and reduced to ashes. After that, I would have to collect the ashes and put them into an urn so they could be given to the family. My uncle and the man in the black suit went into the funeral home next door. I assumed they were filling out all the usual paperwork. I was left alone in the crematorium to continue sweeping. After about 10 minutes, I heard a strange noise coming from the oven. It was like a faint knocking sound at first. I thought it was just my imagination, but then it grew into a loud banging. I tried to tell myself it was just the metal warping from the heat. Bang, bang, bang. It was the unmistakable sound of someone frantically banging on something, desperately trying to get out. A chill went down my spine, and the broom fell from my hands. I was sure the man inside was still alive. Terrified, I ran into the funeral home, and shaking uncontrollably, I told my uncle what I had heard. Leading them back into the crematorium, I told them to listen. Bang! 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 I don't hear anything, said my uncle. Bang! 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 Me neither, said the man in the black suit. I looked at them, shocked and stunned. I even began to doubt my own sanity. My uncle and the man in the black suit shrugged their shoulders and went back to the funeral home. I just stood in the middle of the crematorium, listening intently. I don't know how to open the oven door safely, and, even if I did, I was terrified by what I might find inside. After 10 or 15 minutes in the furnace, could someone still be alive? Gradually the banging noise became weaker and weaker until it finally faded away altogether. All I could hear was the hiss and crackle of the flames. There was no more noise. An hour later my uncle came back to turn off the oven. Together we collected the ashes from the tray underneath and poured them into an urn. The man took it, and with a broad smile on his face, he got back into his car and drove away. At closing time, my uncle gave me an envelope full of money and told me not to mention what I had heard to anyone. We never spoke about it again, and business went on as usual. Even today, I still have nightmares about that hideous banging sound I heard coming from inside the oven. There was a young woman named Esther who lived in Letcher County, Kentucky in 1934. Her boyfriend was a young man named Ezra Jackson, and the couple were very much in love. However, there was an old man who had become obsessed with Esther. He was pestering her all the time and asking her to marry him. She found him repulsive and didn't want anything to do with him. But no matter what she did, she couldn't get him to stop. He was stalking her and she was scared to death. Eventually, she decided that if she had a husband, he might give up and leave her alone. So she married her boyfriend Ezra. After the wedding, as the couple were driving home, the old man suddenly stepped out into the road in front of them. Ezra had to hit the brakes to avoid hitting him. The old man came up to Esther's window and glared in at her. "I'm going to die soon," he growled. "But I'll be back for you, and when I return, you'll go with me." Ezra floored on the accelerator and drove off at a top speed. But Esther was freaked out and couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said. A few days later, the old man was found dead in his home. His body was buried in the local cemetery. He had no friends or relatives, and anyone who had known him, they were afraid of him, so nobody at all mourned his passing. A year after his death, on a snowy night in December, Esther was sitting in her living room reading a book when there was a knock at the front door. Her husband and his 2 brothers were in the kitchen. "I'll see who it is," she called to them. The 3 men heard her open the door, but they didn't hear anyone come in. There were no voices, just an eerie silence. After waiting for a few minutes, they went into the living room and found the door standing wide open. Esther was nowhere to be seen. When they looked outside, they found the tracks of her bare feet in the snow. The 3 men quickly grabbed their coats and flashlights and set off in search of her. They followed the footprints for about 2 miles along the rough, snow-covered country road, until they came to the local cemetery. The footprints led through the gate and right up to the old man's grave, where they vanished. While his 2 brothers waited in the cemetery, Ezra went to fetch help. He came back with several men from the village. It was midnight and the weather was freezing. But together under the light of the flashlights and lanterns, they began to dig up the grave. When they dragged out the coffin and opened it, they were horrified to discover that it was empty. Although a thorough search was made, no trace of the young wife or the old man's body was ever found. To this day, the disappearance of Esther Jackson remains an unsolved mystery. You know how, on Halloween night, people always gather around the campfire and tell scary stories about strange things lurking in the woods, and nobody believes them? Well, sometime those stories are true. Last year, just before Halloween, I was home watching TV when I heard a knock on the front door. When I went to answer it, I found a dog standing on the front porch. I looked around, but I couldn't see the owner anywhere. The dog seemed to be lost. I wasn't sure what breed he was, but he looked like a Siberian Husky. His tongue was hanging out and he was panting like he was thirsty, so I put out a bowl of water for him. The dog lapped up the whole thing. Ever since I was a little girl, I'd always wanted a pet dog, but my parents would never allow me to have one. I didn't want to bring him inside the house, so I put him in the backyard. I gave him some leftovers to eat, but he just turned up his nose at them and refused to touch anything. That evening, when my parents came home, I told them about the lost dog. At first, they told me I would have to get rid of it, but after much begging and pleading, they told me I could keep it. However, they didn't want it inside the house. My mother was allergic to dogs. The dog slept in the garden shed. In the middle of the night, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. I could see the dog's glowing eyes in the darkness. It seemed like he was just standing there, staring up at me. It gave me a very eerie feeling. The next day was Halloween. In the morning, I went to the store and bought a can of dog food. When I got home, I opened it up and put it into a bowl. The dog looked very hungry, but he refused to eat the dog food. I couldn't understand what was wrong with him. That evening, little kids were running up and down the street, dressed in their Halloween costumes. It kinda made me wish I wasn't too old for trick-or-treating. So I decided to take the dog for a walk in the forest behind our house. After a while, we came across a group of 3 teenage girls who were camping in the forest. They were planning to have a Halloween party in the woods, and they had brought some food and drinks with them. The girls were around the same age as me, so we chatted for a while. They asked me if I'd like to join them. One of the girls tried to pet the dog, but he just growled at her. He didn't seem to like being touched by anyone. They were having trouble pitching their tent, so I decided to help them. Between the 4 of us, we managed to set up the tent. I looked around and realized my dog was nowhere to be seen. I asked the girls to help me look for him. By now, it was dark and the stars were out. The moon was pale and full, and the wind was whistling through the trees. We decided to split up into 2 groups. The first 2 girls went off together and I paired up with the third. We spent a long time looking for my dog, but there was no sign of it. Eventually, we gave up and started back towards the tent. Suddenly, we heard shouts and high-pitched screams echoing through the trees. We ran all the way back to the tent, and when we got there, we found the other 2 girls laying in a pool of blood. They were terribly injured. One of the girls was unconscious, and the other was barely clinging to life. I asked her what happened, and she managed to choke out a few words. She grabbed my arm and stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. She said that they had been attacked by some sort of monstrous creature that emerged from the woods. I tried to ask her more questions, but her grip on my arm slowly relaxed, and she died. The third girl burst into tears and couldn't stop trembling. We looked at each other in disbelief. Neither of us knew what to do. We were terrified, but we didn't want to leave the dead girls lying out there in the grass. We decided to carry them into the tent to protect them from being eaten by wild animals. As we crouched inside the tent, desperately trying to think of what to do, we suddenly heard strange noises outside. For a minute, I didn't know if the sounds were real or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It sounded like a dog yelping in pain. I was worried that it was my dog and he might be injured. Working up my courage, I decided to go outside and see where the noises were coming from. The girl didn't want me to leave her alone, but I assured her I would be right back. Cautiously, I slipped out of the tent and searched the clearing. I crept up to the tree line and peered into the forest, but I couldn't see anything. The night was still and eerily silent. All I could hear was the soft whistling of the wind. When I went back to the tent, I was horrified to find it completely destroyed. Inside, the third girl lay dead. Her body had been ripped apart and partially devoured. A wave of fear washed over me and I felt weak at the knees. Afraid to stay out in the forest a moment longer, I took off running through the trees, and I didn't stop until I got to the safety of my own house. My parents asked me what was wrong, and when I told them the horrible story, they called the police. Soon, there were flashing lights in our driveway, and 2 police officers were questioning me about what had happened. They went out into the woods and found the dead bodies of the 3 girls laying in the tent. They didn't find my dog anywhere. The policeman said they must have been attacked by wild animals and told me I was lucky to be alive. They said my dog had probably been eaten by the wild animals as well. The next morning, I was out in my backyard when I got the strangest feeling that I was being watched. When I looked up, I saw my dog standing at the forest's edge. He was just standing there staring at me. Then, he did something that terrified me. He stood up on his hind legs, turned around and walked back into the forest. I never saw him again. The lost dog is still out in those woods. Now and then, somebody spots him lurking in the trees. Whenever there is a full moon, I go around our house making sure all the doors and windows are securely locked. Then, I lie in bed and pray for the morning to arrive. During the summer, my friend Steve went mountain climbing. He had lost his footing and fell off the steep cliff face. Luckily, he landed on a ledge and it saved his life. However, he was badly injured and had to be rescued. He hit his head in the fall, and when they brought him to the hospital, he was still unconscious. The doctors examined him and found a swelling in his brain. He had to have surgery immediately. They were in the operating room for hours and they managed to reduce the swelling, but he was still in a coma. A few days later, he recovered and I went to visit him in the hospital. He told me that while he was unconscious, he had a very, very strange dream. In the dream, Steve found himself standing in a deserted train station. There was nobody else in sight. When the train pulled into the station, he got on board. There were no other passengers on the train. Steve was completely alone. After a long time, the train started slowing down and it pulled into another station. He looked out the window and saw the platform was deserted. Just then, he heard a low, crackling voice over the intercom. Next stop. Final stop. Next stop. End of the line. Something about the announcement set a chill down his spine. He jumped out of his seat and managed to get off the train just as the doors were closing. That was the moment when he awoke from the coma. The doctors told him he was lucky to survive. For a while he had been lingering between life and death, they said. While Steve told me about his dream, I could see he was becoming upset and his face was growing pale. I asked him why it troubled him so much, and he said, "What if I hadn't got off at that train station? What would have happened if I'd stayed on the train to the end of the line?" It seems so cliche to start by saying I don't believe in ghosts, but, however, that's where I'm coming from.
A few years ago, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment, and it was my first time that I was living on my own. So the apartment block had been built in the 1930s, and I'd been there for a few months when I came home from work one day and went into the bathroom. I saw something strange. The wooden board covering a hole in the ceiling that led to a small attic space lay broken in 2 pieces on the ground. I examined the broken pieces. The board was an inch thick, and it would have taken a Bruce Lee-type person to break it. I thought the landlord had sent someone to work on the attic. I was frozen stiff with fear. I thought, someone is up there for sure. So later on that night, I emailed the pictures to the landlord asking if anyone had been there. Of course, with an undertone of annoyance since she hadn't warned me. Her reply read, "Please call me as soon as you're able to." So I called, and she explained that her last 2 tenants had the same thing happen. She promised to replace the board, and of course she did. About a month later, I woke up one night around 4 a.m., and I had so many goosebumps, it felt like someone was rubbing his or hands on me. Everything was silent, but then I heard this sound coming from above my bed. It was a dragging sound, like someone pulling a sack of potatoes. I was frozen stiff with fear. I thought, someone is up there for sure, but there's no way an animal can make that sound. After 5 minutes, I managed to work up the courage to turn on the light and walk to the bathroom. I was armed with a baseball bat, of course. When I looked, I saw the new board covering the hole was broken in 2 again. I felt sick to my stomach. The dragging sound had stopped, but then I heard something else. Whispering. The sound was clear and coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and all I could hear was one sentence repeated over and over again. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I switched on every light in the apartment to make things feel normal. It was 5 a.m. and it was dark outside. So I decided to watch TV to try and unwind. Then, a fuse blew. So my pet budgie Dexter, whom I kept in the kitchen, he usually never made a sound at night, but he started to squawk like he was being strangled. I'd never heard them make those noises before. He was basically screaming. So I grabbed my car keys, ran out, and sat in my car and waited till the sun came up. When I saw people walking their dogs, this comforted me enough to go back inside. The front door was open, but I thought I hadn't closed it when I ran outside. So I went into the kitchen to check on Dexter, and he wasn't in his cage. I felt sick again. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked into the bathroom, I heard a splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him up, and dried him off. I was so confused. I had no idea what was happening. So around 8 o'clock in the morning, I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. And her reply was, "Oh wow, you heard the whispering too?" So I stayed in that apartment for another 18 months, almost 2 years. I did hear the whispering on a few occasions, and twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling had moved. Although now I live elsewhere, the landlord recently called. She said that her new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. I thought to myself, forget it. It's their problem now. One evening when I was in my junior year of high school, my mom and dad went out, leaving me home alone. I had a lot of homework to do, so I spent the whole evening sitting at my desk in my bedroom. My parents left the house around 6 p.m. While I was doing my homework, I put on my headphones and listened to really loud music. There was a big storm that night, and my desk was facing the window so I could see the rain and the lightning outside. My parents got back around 11 p.m. When I saw their car drive up, I took off my headphones, and as soon as my mom opened the front door and came inside, I heard her shout my name. "What on earth happened in here?" she demanded in an angry voice. Confused, I ran downstairs. My mom was standing in the hallway with a furious look on her face. She pointed at the floor and yelled, "Was this you?" I looked down and I saw the carpet was covered in muddy footprints. "I have no idea how those got there," I said. "I spent the whole night at my desk doing my homework. I watched as they looked around, and the looks on their face had changed from anger to confusion, and then to fear. We both realized it at the same time. Someone else must have been in the house. So we followed the trail of footprints, trying to make sense of the whole situation. They started at the back door, which we usually left unlocked. Then we noticed something else. The footprints may have started at the back door, but there was no trail of footprints leaving through the back door. All of a sudden we heard something, a really loud pounding noise that echoed throughout the house. Then the sound of the front door being wrenched open and slammed shut again. Wham! We all ran into the garage and locked the door behind us. My mom took out her cell phone and called the police. "Please come quickly," she shouted. "Someone's in our house." After what seemed like hours, a patrol car arrived with 2 police officers, a male and a female. One officer stayed with us in the garage while his partner went through the house, searching it room by room. When she came back, the female officer told us that there was nobody in the house and it was safe to go back in. As we were all breathing a sigh of relief, she asked, "Whose bedroom is upstairs on the left?" My parents looked at me. "Well, that's my bedroom," I told the officer. She asked us to follow her. As we walked through the house, we could see the trail of muddy footprints leading from the back door, through the living room, through the hallway and up the stairs, into my parents' bedroom, and then towards my room. They stopped at my doorway. The female officer pointed at my door, which had been open the whole night, but scrawled on it in black marker was the following: 8:47 p.m. I see you. 8:53 p.m. You forgot to lock the back door. 8:59. You seem focused. 9:24. Turn around. 9:47. Look at me. 10:15. Look at me. 10:37. Look at me. 10:49. Look at me. For more than 2 hours, someone had been standing in my doorway, watching me. To this day, I still shudder to think what would have happened if I had actually turned around. On the morning of her birthday, Lucy's mother woke her up and told her a package had arrived in the mail, and it was addressed to her. The girl hurried up and unwrapped the package and was horrified at what she found inside. It was the most disgusting old doll she had ever seen. It was completely bald, and its skin was cracked and caked in dirt. The worst thing of all was its teeth. They were long, pointy, sharp, and beastly. They looked like some sort of animal's fangs. With a shiver, she took the doll and threw it in a corner. Her mother scolded her, telling her that someone had gone through a lot of trouble to send her that antique doll. Her mother told her she had better appreciate it. Lucy tried to protest, but her mother would not listen. She forced the young girl to keep the doll. So, to put her mind at rest, Lucy stuffed the antique doll into the little cupboard under the stairs, behind a pile of shoes where she wouldn't have to look at the ugly, evil little thing. It was not until a few nights later, when Lucy was laying in bed and she heard a noise, a shuffling sound, which went on for about 5 minutes. Then a brief dragging noise, and finally a scuttling like footsteps walking very fast. By now Lucy was shaking her head in bed with fear, unable to move. Then she thought she heard a faint, raspy voice whispering quietly from downstairs. Lucy always slept with the door open and the landing light on, as she was a little scared of the dark. She heard the voice say, "Lucy, I'm on the first step," and then a loud, scrabbling noise again, as whatever was speaking apparently turned tail and returned to its place of hiding. Lucy was so scared that she didn't sleep a wink that night, but laid in fear until the break of dawn, when her mother got her up for school. Lucy tried to explain to her mother what had happened the night before, but she was so tired that when her mother passed it off as just a dream, she began to believe it might be the case, but of course it wasn't. Lucy had begged her parents to let her throw the antique doll in the garbage, but insisted that it was a present and that she had to keep it. So Lucy reluctantly went back to bed, telling herself that it had only been a dream. She checked the cupboard under the stairs, but the doll was exactly where Lucy had left her that night. Lucy fought sleep, but she eventually drifted off even though she had fought to stay awake. Presently, the deep, disembodied voice woke her up again. She wondered if she could only hear it in her head. "Lucy, I'm on the 4th step," it said. Then came the scuffling noises, and the voice didn't reoccur that night. Lucy was crying by now, and again, she didn't sleep that night. At school, Lucy told her friends about the doll, and of course they laughed at her. Lucy could only think that if the doll was climbing 4 steps at a time, that there was only one more night to go. That night, Lucy decided to shut her bedroom door. When her mother turned out her light, she asked why Lucy was no longer scared of the dark. Lucy replied that she was, and could she leave her light on instead of the hall light. But her mother pointed out that her bedroom light was so bright that it would keep her awake, and she said no. Therefore, Lucy agreed to just sleep without a light. She opened the bedroom curtains instead to light the room a little anyway. Just as she began to doze, she heard the noise, and the voice came. Very, very clear this time. "Lucy, I'm on the top step." In the darkness of her bedroom, Lucy heard a click and trembled with fear. She wasn't sure, but she thought she could see her bedroom door opening very, very slowly. The next morning, Lucy's parents found her body at the bottom of the stairs. They guessed that she had been on her way to the toilet during the night, and in the darkness slipped and fallen down the stairs, breaking her neck. The antique doll was found beside her body and was buried with Lucy. Everyone said what a tragedy it was. "She loved that doll," said her mother. "Now they can be together forever."
It all began when we moved into the old house. One day my 4-year-old daughter started screaming at something she had seen in the living room. She said it was a cloud of red mist that had emerged from the corner of the room. It enveloped her and it had a horrible smell that made her sick. Then it just disappeared. At first we just dismissed it, but a few days later my wife's sister came to visit and she brought her 2 little daughters. The little girls said they saw a cloud of red mist appear from the same corner and it enveloped them too. Later that same day, my wife saw the cloud of red mist come out of the corner and wrap itself around her. She said it felt hot and suffocating and stank of burning meat. One night, my 6-year-old son heard the front door opening, so he went down to investigate. The door was open, and in the doorway he could see an odd red mist that slowly disappeared before his eyes. At this point I was still skeptical of all these stories. That changed the night I fell asleep downstairs and had a very strange dream. In the dream I walked into her bedroom, but it was completely different. There were no beds and it was furnished as a living room. There was a sofa, and sitting on it I saw a beautiful woman with dark red hair. She was not my wife, but in the dream, I somehow knew she was my wife. She was crying, and when she turned around to look at me, her eyes were blackened and filled with tears. She had a look of fear on her face, and when I moved towards her, she cowered as if she was being beaten. Just then I heard a voice behind me. It was the voice of a young boy. I turned and saw a boy standing in the doorway. He was wearing red corduroy pants and a red sweater. He was soaking wet from head to toe, and his skin looked ashen and lifeless. He was not my son, but in the dream, I somehow knew he was my son. The boy looked up at me. "Dad," he said with a look of fear in his eyes. "Dad, help me." Suddenly I woke up and found myself sitting on the sofa downstairs. My wife was sitting beside me and she screamed at me. "What was that?" I realized there was sounds of a struggle going on upstairs. We could hear furniture being thrown at the sound, and the sound of breaking glass. I jumped off the sofa and ran upstairs, but when I got to the top of the stairs, everything went silent. There was nobody there, nothing out of place, no sign of anything wrong. All I saw was a strange red mist in the hallway. It had an iridescent glow and gradually dissipated until it disappeared. I returned downstairs to tell my wife what I had seen. We sat there in silence, unsure of what was happening, and waited for the dawn to come. That morning I was standing on my front porch, still trying to make sense of the dream that I had had. My son was playing in the garden, and all of a sudden I heard him call out. A chill ran down my spine as I heard him say, "Dad?" I turned and looked down the hill. My son said, "Dad, help me." I ran over to him and saw he was digging something out of the ground. It was a strip of red corduroy material. I went to help him, but when I pulled the material away, I saw a flash of white bone underneath. I grabbed my son and we ran into the house. We called the police, and when they came, they dug up the remains of a little boy. He had been buried in our garden. They said he was about 6 years old when he died. He was wearing red corduroy pants and a red pullover. The police are trying to locate the man who lived in the house before us. He was the father of the boy, and they believe he murdered his own son. But they haven't been able to find him. They also believe he murdered his wife, but they can't find her body. They do have old pictures of her. She was a beautiful woman with dark red hair.
I want to tell you about a girl and a doll. I know what you're thinking. You've heard this story before. A little girl wants a doll, someone buys it for her, and then the doll goes mental and kills everyone. Well, you're wrong. This is a different kind of story. It happened back in 2009 when I was 16. One day as I was walking home from school, I noticed that a new family had moved into the house at the end of my street. They were a young married couple, and they had a little daughter who looked like she may have been around 6 years old. She wore a white dress, white socks, and black shoes, and her hair was long and black, and she was holding a doll in her arms. The doll had on a white dress and also had long black hair. In fact, it looked almost exactly like a miniature version of the girl. Every day on my way home from school, I saw the little girl. She was always sitting there outside her house, cradling the doll in her arms and watching me as I passed by. There was something about the way she stared at me and the cold, dark look in her eyes that really unnerved me. At night, I couldn't sleep. I was plagued by the very strange dreams and woke up in a cold sweat. I can only vaguely remember the dreams, but they all involved the girl and the doll. This went on night after night, and the lack of sleep had left me exhausted. There was an old lady who had lived next door, and she was very inquisitive. She was one of these old women who knew everything about everyone, and she was always eavesdropping and sticking her nose into other people's business. One day, as I was walking to school, she grabbed me by the arm, and in a hushed tone, she said that she had something to tell me. She wanted to talk about the family who moved into the house at the end of the street. "You don't want to mess with them," she told me. "They're not good people. I've heard that they're always on the move and never stay for very long. And that daughter of theirs, did you know that she's adopted? She's not right in the head either. I've heard rumors that she's the offspring of the devil, and the doll she carries around is not a doll at all, but a demon made in her image." I just rolled my eyes and walked away, dismissing it as the idle gossip of a crazy old woman. But oh, how silly I was. How I wish I had listened to the warnings of that crazy old lady. A few days later, there was a knock at our front door. When I answered it, a young woman was standing there. She was the mother of the little girl with the doll. "Hello," she said. "I'm your neighbor, and I'd like to ask you to do me a favor." "Sure," I replied. "What is it?" "Well, something unexpectedly came up," she said, "and I have to go on an errand, and my husband doesn't get home from work until later. I'll only be gone a few hours, but I need someone to look after my daughter while I'm gone. I know it's short notice, but could you take care of her?" "Well, of course," I said. "What's your daughter's name?" "Her name is Lisa," the mother replied, "but we need to leave now, so if you don't mind." I followed the woman to her house, and I waited while she rushed upstairs. When she returned, she was leading the little girl by the hand. As soon as I saw her, I was taken aback. There was something wrong with her. Her eyes were completely black, like the eyes of a shark, and she was still clutching that wretched doll in her arms. I didn't know what it was about that doll that creeped me out so much. Perhaps it was because it looked so much like the little girl that it was disturbing and uncanny. Before I had a chance to back out, the mother said her goodbyes, then got into the car and drove away. Without a word, Lisa reached up and took me by the hand. Her skin was ice cold to the touch, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Play with me," she said. So we went upstairs to her bedroom, but as soon as I closed the door, I began to feel uneasy. I could detect a strange, unpleasant smell in the room, but I couldn't figure out what it was or where it was coming from. I played with Lisa for about 30 minutes, but then I began to feel a tightness in my chest. I broke out into a cold sweat and my stomach was churning. I felt like I was going to vomit. "I have to go," I gasped. All of a sudden, Lisa scrambled to her feet and cried out, "No, you're not going. You're going to stay here with me forever and we'll play all the time." She stared at me with those cold black eyes, and I felt like I was going to faint. I was frightened and I wanted to get out of that room. But when I tried to open the door, the handle wouldn't turn. I began rattling it and pulling on it, but it was no use. So I ran to the window and I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. No matter what I tried, I couldn't open it. Then I remembered the warning of the old woman and cursed myself for not listening to her. I was trembling with fear, but I decided to recite a prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." As soon as I uttered those words, the little girl let out an ear-splitting screech. She screamed so loud that I thought I was going deaf and I had to clasp my hands over my ears, but I never stopped reciting the prayer. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The girl dropped the doll and it fell to the floor. All of a sudden, it came to life and it came at me, gnashing its teeth and scratching with its clawed hands like a feral animal. I tried to kick it away, but it jumped at my neck and tried to tear my throat out. I fell backwards on the bed, desperately trying to fight the doll off. It was a terrible struggle. The doll was thrashing back and forth, scraping me and tearing at my clothes. Every time it got its hands around my neck, it started to throttle me. Eventually, I got the upper hand. I grabbed it by the legs and swung it with all my might, smashing its head against the wall. It hit the wall so hard that it left a dent in the plaster. A crack split the doll's face in two, and a thick black smoke began pouring out. "And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." The doll lay on the floor, shaking and wriggling, flopping back and forth like a dying fish. The doll's head split wider, and the smoke billowing out grew thicker and thicker. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen." When I finished reciting the prayer, Lisa was laying in the middle of the room, unconscious, and the doll was a little more than a steaming pile of molten plastic, hissing and bubbling on the carpet. Just then, Lisa's mother came home. She ran upstairs and burst into the room, demanding to know what happened. I tried to explain, but I couldn't get the words out. I threw up all over the floor. When Lisa regained consciousness, she said that she remembered nothing. Nothing at all. I looked into her eyes. The blackness was gone, and there was a bright, vibrant shade of blue. 3 years later, when she was only 9 years old, Lisa died suddenly. She had drank an entire bottle of bleach, and it corroded her insides. She died in tremendous pain, screaming and crying in agony as her organs slowly broke down and dissolved. The doctors ruled it an accident, but everybody suspected that she had taken her own life. Her parents were devastated. No one could explain why a girl so young would do such a thing. A week after the funeral, her mother and father moved out of the house. It held too many bad memories. As they were going through Lisa's bedroom and packing up her belongings, they found something glued to the back of her mirror. It was a photo of Lisa and the doll. On the other side, written in a childish scrawl, was a message. "She has returned to us. For those who answer our call will be damned forever." When I was 4 years old, my mom and I moved into a large colonial house that was built in the late 1800s. My mom always had a weird feeling about the house. There was this little bricked-off section in the basement, and we never knew why it was there. My mother told me that soon after we moved into the house, I suddenly had an imaginary friend. One day, out of the blue, I told her that I had been playing with a little girl named Jenny. She thought that it was just a phase and didn't pay much attention to it. I told her that Jenny wanted me to let the cat go into the basement so that she could play with it. My mother allowed me to let the cat go down there. It never came back. That creeped her out. Then, a few days later, I told her Jenny wanted me to go down in the basement to play with her. My mother refused and told me to go upstairs to bed. I did, and when I woke up the next morning, I had deep scratches on my back and legs. My mom decided to research the history of the house. She found an old picture of the house and the family who used to live there. She showed me the picture and asked if I recognized any of them. There were 7 little girls in the picture, and, without hesitation, I pointed to one of them. The name of all the family members were written on the back. The girl I had pointed to was named Jenny. My mother got scared because during her research, she had discovered that the girl named Jenny had gone down into the basement one day and was never seen again. The family never found her, and they moved shortly after that. After I identified the girl in the picture, it was all way too much for my mom to handle. We moved out of the house and found somewhere else to live. When I was 18, my mom told me about what had happened in that house. It still scares me to think about it.
About a month ago, my girlfriend and I got engaged. We moved into a new apartment and began living together. It was the first time either of us had shared an apartment, so it was a new experience for both of us. We were deeply in love. I knew she was the one I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I thought she felt the same thing about me. Everything went well until about 2 weeks ago, when I noticed that my girlfriend was acting very strange. She became so attached to me that it felt like she couldn't stand being away from me for a moment. One evening she said to me, "Darling, when you're not home, I still feel you near me." I didn't attach much importance to these words. I thought she was just being affectionate. However, a few days later, she told me something else. "Whenever you're at work," she said, "I often hear your voice, as if you're calling my name." This began to happen more and more as the days went by, and I started to get a little worried about her. One day, I arrived home from work. I found her sitting silently at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall with a glazed look in her eyes. I grabbed a chair, sat down beside her, and asked her what was the matter. "I think there's something wrong with me," she murmured. "Well, why do you think that?" I asked. "I saw you today," she said. "You walked from the kitchen into the bedroom, then you stood back to me, staring out the window." "But I was at work all day," I said. "I know," she replied with a sigh. That's when I really began to worry. I suspected that my girlfriend was losing her mind and having hallucinations. Over the next few days, she kept telling me that she saw me in the apartment when I was at work. She could even describe exactly what I was wearing. My girlfriend was acting more and more strange. She was getting more and more quiet as she was terrified of being left alone. Sometimes she would just sit there, silently staring at me. Last night my girlfriend was very tired and decided to go to bed early. I held her hand and sat on the edge of the bed as she was falling asleep. Just before she nodded off, she said, "You're not here." "Honey, I'm right here," I explained. "Don't worry, everything is fine." "No, you're not here," she said. "You're in the kitchen." Just then I heard a dull noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a chair scraping across the linoleum. Then I heard the sound of footsteps walking down the hallway. Fear gripped my heart. I didn't know what to do. All of a sudden the handle on the bedroom door began to turn, and the door slowly began to open. Maybe it's just a draft, I thought as my eyes grew wide with fear. But it wasn't a draft. The door swung open, and I saw a man standing there in the doorway. It was me. It's difficult to describe exactly what I saw. It was me, but at the same time, it wasn't me. It was as if I was staring at myself in a mirror, but the other me had cold, lifeless eyes. The other me looked at me for a moment, then turned and left, shutting the door behind him. It took me a moment to recover from the shock, and then I sprang off the bed and ran after him. The hallway was empty. I checked the kitchen, then the bathroom, but he was nowhere to be found. The other me simply vanished. It was terrifying. And then I stood in the hallway, trying to figure out what had just happened, trying to calm myself down and convince myself that it was just a hallucination. I heard a faint voice coming from the kitchen. It wasn't my voice. It was the voice of my girlfriend. "We are here to stay," she said. "Forever." I realized my girlfriend wasn't in the kitchen. She was lying in the bedroom, exactly where I just left her seconds before. I was so frightened I started trembling like a leaf. I ran into the bedroom, grabbed my girlfriend, and dragged her with me out the front door. We left the apartment that very moment and spent the night at my parents' house. Tomorrow we will go back to pick up our things. I still can't understand what happened in that apartment, but neither of us can bear to spend another night there. Hopefully, when we pick up our things, all will be well and no one will be there.
If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll